From cave wall hands to the printing press, empires rose in a giant mess. Silk road spice and a compass spin. Humans kept inventing trouble again. A pharaoh blinked and a kingdom fell. Romans built roads and aqueducts well. Mongols rode through half the earth, changing maps for what it's worth. We mapped the stars, crossed every sea, argued on what gods could be. Trade, revolt, philosophy, history's one big conspiracy. It all started with a buffer. Wait! The Buffer History Podcast, where timelines crash and cultures talk back. From Delhi courts to Viking raids to Cold War spies and samurai blades. We got revolutions, treaties, kings, tiny events changing everything. One bad border, one coup, one chart, and suddenly the whole world falls apart. So gather round, don't lose the plot, cause history's way weirder than we were taught. The past ain't dead, it's broadcasting live on Buffer History tonight.
You know, usually when we think about a corporate scandal, there's this built-in expectation of scale. Like our modern minds go straight to cooked books or maybe some deliberately shredded documents.
Right, or like a CEO fleeing extradition on a private jet or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we think of wire fraud or, tech startups completely lying about their user numbers.
Yeah.
It's almost always contained within this sterile realm of finance and legal loopholes.
Yeah, which is how we typically define white-collar crime, right?
Right.
It happens in these quiet boardrooms or in offshore banking havens, maybe deep within the code of some high-frequency trading algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
The damage is profound, obviously, but it rarely involves, infantry.
Precisely.
Yep.
But I want you, and I mean you listening right now, to just step outside that modern framework for a second. Imagine a contemporary multinational corporation.
Like a massive tech giant or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or like an international shipping conglomerate. Imagine them deciding that mere market dominance just isn't enough anymore. Imagine this corporate entity deciding to build its own private, heavily armed military force.
Oh, wow.
And imagine them deploying that force to overthrow a sovereign foreign government, executing the head of state, and then violently subjugating a population of 100 million people.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. And imagine they do all of this, every single bit of it, for one singular purpose, to guarantee their quarterly stock dividends remain robust.
I mean, when you frame it like that, it honestly sounds like the premise of a dystopian sci-fi novel, like some cyberpunk scenario where the nation state has totally collapsed and mega corporations have just carved up the planet.
It really does.
Yeah.
But we are not exploring science fiction today. Welcome to this deep dive on the Buffer History Podcast. Today, we're not just walking through some standard, boring textbook recounting of dates and treaties.
Far from it.
We're unpacking the mechanics of what is arguably the greatest, most devastating true crime story ever recorded. Our mission is to dissect how a single, dangerously unregulated joint stock corporation,
Headquartered in this tiny 5-window-wide office in London, by the way.
right, how they managed to swallow an entire subcontinent. We're looking at the completely amoral evolution of the East India Company, or the EIC, and we're going to trace the true birth of corporate crime.
It's a heavy topic, for sure.
Definitely. And just to lay down a quick sourcing rule before we jump in, whenever we reference the specific historical details from our main material today, we will explicitly say, in William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, he says, just to ensure we are meticulously tracking where this staggering historical data originates.
Yeah, and exploring this requires us to fundamentally shift a massive misconception we have about history. Collective memory often defaults to this idea that the quote-unquote British Empire just marched in and conquered India.
Right, like the king sent the army.
Exactly, but that is factually incorrect. For the vast majority of the history, the British government wasn't the primary actor at all. It was a for-profit corporation.
Answering only to its shareholders.
Yep, not to a parliament, not to a king, just shareholders looking for a return on investment.
So if we're going to treat this like the ultimate corporate heist, which it functionally was, we really need to understand the mark before we look at the criminals. Let's talk about the target here, the wealth of the Mughal Empire.
You really have to know what you're acquiring if you're launching a hostile takeover.
Exactly. Just how big was this target?
Well, to understand the sheer audacity of this eventual corporate takeover, you have to picture the victim in its absolute unassailable prime. Before the East India Company was anything more than just a localized nuisance, the Mughal Empire was an absolute titan on the global stage.
Like untouchable.
Totally. Under emperors like Jahangir in the early 17th century and later Aurangzeb, The Mughals commanded this staggering demographic. We're talking about roughly 100 million people living under their administration.
Just to anchor that for you listening, that is 5 times the population of the Ottoman Empire at its height.
It's massive.
It's a demographic scale
Yeah.
that Europeans at the time could barely even conceptualize.
Exactly. And they protected this vast population with a military apparatus that kind of defies modern comprehension. At its peak, the Mughal military machine could field an army of 4 million men under arms.
4 million.
Yeah, but their true power wasn't just, cavalry and cannons. It was in their profound economic dominance. The Mughal Empire produced a quarter of all global manufacturing.
A quarter of the whole world's manufacturing.
They were the workshop of the world. If you wanted the finest textiles, the best dyed calicos, exquisite silks, or just massive volumes of spices, you had to go through them. Economically, they were rivaled only by Ming Dynasty China.
And the physical manifestation of that wealth is almost, it's hard to process. We're talking about artifacts like the Peacock Throne.
Oh, the Peacock Throne is legendary.
Right. Which wasn't just a chair, but a massive platform, literally encrusted with the most precious jewels on Earth. It cost twice as much as the construction of the Taj Mahal.
It's just absurd wealth.
And they possessed the Koh-i-Noor diamond. And their urban centers were magnificent. In William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, he says the courtier and intellectual Anand Mukhlis described the capital, Delhi, as being like a cage of tumultuous nightingales.
Such a beautiful description.
It really is. It was a city significantly larger, wealthier, and more cosmopolitan than London and Paris combined.
It was the undisputed epicenter of global wealth, refined high culture, and centralized power.
So keeping that immense, almost terrifying scale in mind, let's look at the early English traders. I want to build a little analogy here. Imagine these early English merchants washing up on the shores of India.
Okay.
They're absolute nobodies. It's the equivalent of like a couple of guys operating out of a damp garage in a minor European city, trying to score a direct sit-down meeting with the CEO of the world's biggest, most heavily armed multinational conglomerate.
The asymmetry of those early encounters is honestly almost comical. The English were practically beggars, loitering at the gates of a gilded palace.
Right. Just look at the EIC's early emissary, Captain William Hawkins, who arrives in 1608. He's described as a bibulous sea dog, which is basically just a fancy way of saying a heavy-drinking sailor.
Yeah, not exactly a polished diplomat.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And he decides to dress up as an Afghan nobleman, evidently thinking this is going to help him blend into the highly refined Persian-speaking Mughal court.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he somehow manages to leverage his way into a brief audience with Emperor Jahangir, but the emperor quickly realizes this guy has absolutely nothing to offer.
He's just a guy in a costume.
Exactly. Hawkins leaves with absolutely no trade agreement, no concessions, nothing except an Armenian Christian wife that the emperor essentially handed to him as a novelty gift. The English were just a complete non-entity.
The Mughal administration barely even registered their existence in the grand scheme of things. To the Mughals, the Portuguese were the actual maritime threat they had to deal with. The EIC, realizing how incredibly outgunned they were, understood they had to play a very long, very cautious game.
Keep their heads down.
Precisely. Their initial corporate strategy was defined by extreme deference. The leadership back in London explicitly instructed their agents in India to avoid building heavily fortified garrisons and to absolutely avoid land wars. The directive was to maintain what they called a quiet trade.
And just for the benefit of context, we should probably clarify what an agent meant back then.
Yeah.
They operated through what were called factors.
Yes, that's a crucial term to understand. To a modern ear, a factor sounds like a mathematical variable.
Well.
But in the vocabulary of 17th century mercantilism, a factor was a commercial agent.
Like a middleman.
Exactly. They were men stationed at a factory, which wasn't a place where things were actually manufactured, but rather a fortified warehouse and trading post where the factors bought local goods to store until the company ships arrived from England.
So their entire mandate is basically stay in your warehouses, buy textiles, keep your heads down, and for the love of God, do not antagonize the people with the 4 million man army.
Which is really the only logical strategy for a tiny startup.
And there's always but they broke their own rule, didn't they? They got arrogant long before they had the actual power to back it up.
Oh, they did, and it resulted in a spectacular, truly humiliating disaster. Jump forward to 1686. The EIC is under the leadership of a man named Sir Josiah Child.
Josiah Child.
Yeah, he was deeply avaricious, fiercely ambitious and operating entirely out of London, which meant he was completely disconnected from the reality on the ground in India.
A classic disconnected CEO.
Exactly. The EIC factors in Bengal had been sending back complaints about local Mughal officials demanding higher taxes and generally disrespecting the company's trading privileges. Child, suffering from this fatal combination of arrogance and profound ignorance regarding Mughal military scale, decided it was time to, quote, draw the English sword.
So he decides to wage an actual war against the Mughal Empire. What exactly does he send to accomplish this?
He sends a fleet of 19 warships and exactly 600 soldiers.
Wait, 600?
600.
600 soldiers. Against a state that can mobilize 4 million? I mean, that's not a military strategy. That is corporate suicide. What was the mechanism of their defeat? Did the Mughals even have to try?
The Mughal war machine didn't even have to stretch its capabilities. It simply swatted the English away like flies. Local Mughal forces easily overwhelmed the English positions in Bengal, completely expelling them.
Just push them right out.
Yep. And simultaneously, on the other side of the subcontinent, the Mughal navy blockaded Bombay, basically starving the English settlement. The EIC was brought to its knees almost instantly.
So how do they survive? I mean, if you attack a massive empire, the standard protocol is that they execute you and seize all your assets.
They survived by abandoning every single ounce of dignity they had. EIC envoys had to literally prostrate themselves, lying completely flat on their faces before the Mughal emperor begging for forgiveness.
Wow.
Yeah, they were forced to pay an astronomical fine, return all the shipping they had seized, and promise to behave exactly like the subordinate merchants they actually were.
And the Mughals just let them stay.
The Mughals allowed them to return to their factories simply because the EIC brought in silver, which was good for the local economy. But the lesson was seared into the corporate memory. You cannot rob the bank while the guards are awake and heavily armed.
Okay, so that establishes our baseline. The EIC knows they are militarily irrelevant on land. They are entirely dependent on Mughal goodwill just to exist. So what is the mechanism of change here? How do we get from factors begging on their hands and knees to an autonomous corporate state launching a hostile takeover?
For that, you have to look at the internal architecture of the empire itself. The vault doesn't get broken into. The vault collapses from structural failure.
Okay.
The inciting incident for this collapse begins with Emperor Aurangzeb.
Wait, the same emperor who swatted them away in 1686?
The very same. Under Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire reached its absolute greatest territorial extent, pushing deep into southern India. But Aurangzeb was fundamentally different from his predecessors.
How so?
Well, earlier emperors like Akbar had maintained control through religious tolerance and strategic alliances, particularly with the Hindu Rajput warrior classes. Aurangzeb, however, was puritanical, orthodox, and rigidly intolerant. He reimposed taxes on non-Muslims, destroyed temples, and alienated the vast Hindu populations across the subcontinent. Crucially, his bigotry shattered the alliance with the Rajputs, who had served as the elite vanguard of the Mughal military.
So he's systematically dismantling the social and military alliances that actually held this massive administrative structure together.
Yeah.
He's basically alienating his own board of directors, so to speak.
Exactly. And when you crack a structure that large, the resulting power vacuum is immense. The most significant consequence of all this was the rise of the Marathas.
Right, let's detail the Marathas because they are a really crucial piece of this puzzle. They aren't just some minor local rebellion.
Far from it. Emerging from the rugged Deccan plateau under their legendary, highly brilliant leader, Shivaji Bhonsle, the Marathas were a fierce Hindu warrior confederacy. They didn't fight set-piece battles where the heavy Mughal artillery could just crush them.
They fought smart.
Very smart. They utilized highly mobile, light cavalry guerrilla tactics. They built impenetrable hill forts, created their own navy, and launched devastating raids deep into the wealthiest Mughal provinces, extracting their own taxes. They became the absolute nemesis of Aurangzeb's later years.
And it wasn't just the Marathas, right? The entire countryside seems to catch fire. The Jats, the Sikhs, and the Punjab region, everyone basically realizes the central authority is vulnerable.
Precisely. Aurangzeb spent the last decades of his life dragged into this endless, grinding war of attrition in the south, completely exhausting the imperial treasury. The empire's revenue streams began to severely dry up because the agricultural heartlands were in open, continuous revolt.
And while this entire political ecosystem is slowly bleeding to death, what is the East India Company doing?
They are essentially just maintaining their quiet trade and watching the chaos unfold. They're watching regional governors, known as Nawabs, slowly stop sending tax revenue back to the capital in Delhi, effectively setting up their own independent breakaway states.
But the fatal blow, the moment the Mughal state is truly decapitated, doesn't come from an internal rebellion, right? It comes from the outside, around 1739.
Yes, the invasion of Nader Shah.
Let's talk about Nader Shah.
Nader Shah was a staggeringly brilliant, utterly ruthless Persian warlord who had seized control of Iran. Recognizing the weakness in Delhi, he marches a battle-hardened army into northern India. At this point, the Mughal emperor is a man named Muhammad Shah.
Let's paint a picture of Muhammad Shah, because he is the stark opposite of the warlike Nader Shah, isn't he?
Really was. Muhammad Shah was often described as effete, deeply cultured, but totally focused on courtly partners, poetry, and music. He was completely unequipped to handle a military genius of Nader Shah's caliber.
And the mechanism by which Nader Shah captures him is almost absurd. It isn't some prolonged, grinding siege of the massive walls of Delhi. In William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, he says the effete Mughal emperor Muhammad Shah was captured by the simple ruse of being invited to dinner and not allowed to leave.
It's one of the most astonishing moments in military history. I mean, Nader Shah defeats the disorganized Mughal army in the field at Karnal. He then essentially says to Muhammad Shah, hey, let's discuss terms over a meal.
And he just goes.
Muhammad Shah arrives, and Nader Shah simply takes him hostage. With the emperor captive, Nader Shah marches unopposed right into Delhi.
And what follows is basically the systematic financial castration of the empire.
Systematic is the perfect word for it. A rumor started that Nader Shah had been assassinated, which led the citizens of Delhi to attack his soldiers. In retaliation, Nader Shah ordered a general massacre.
Horrific.
But beyond the horrific loss of life, he demanded an indemnity that is almost impossible to calculate in modern terms. He physically emptied the Mughal treasury, he took the peacock throne, he took the Kohinoor diamond.
Just packed it all up.
Yeah, he gathered so much gold, silver, and jewels that he literally suspended taxation in Persia for 3 years. He bankrupted the wealthiest empire on earth in a single campaign, and then he just marched back to Persia.
Leaving Muhammad Shah sitting in a looted palace, a totally powerless figurehead over a broken state. So I want to form a hypothesis here, just to make sure I'm grasping the reality of the timeline. It feels like the English didn't actually have to do much heavy lifting to destroy the Mughal Empire. The state essentially died of a massive internal heart attack, followed by a blunt force trauma to the head from Persia.
That's a great way to put it.
The East India Company was just the corporate entity standing in the room when the will was read. Are we overstating British military prowess by assuming they conquered the Mughals?
That is an incredibly astute way to frame it, and it hits on the core truth. The East India Company did not defeat the Mughal Empire at the height of its power. They never could have.
Right.
The EIC simply walked into a fractured, bleeding, post-apocalyptic political landscape. They looked around at the various regional warlords, the Marathas, the newly independent Nobs of Bengal and Awadh, all violently fighting over the scraps of the former empire. And the EIC leadership realized that the overarching authority was gone. The guards had abandoned their posts.
The vault was wide open.
Exactly. The ultimate corporate takeover was suddenly mechanically possible.
Okay, that clarifies the environment immensely. But it brings up a mechanical problem. It's one thing to see an opportunity, it's another to actually execute it. How does a company whose primary skill set involves, inspecting calico cloth and balancing ledgers pivot into a private military contractor capable of dominating these regional warlords?
They needed a paradigm shift in how they operated, and ironically, they didn't invent this new method of corporate militarism. They stole the blueprint directly from their biggest European corporate rivals, the French.
The French company it isn't. So what was the French innovation that changed the game?
It was masterminded by the brilliant and highly ambitious French governor, Joseph-François Dupleix. Dupleix observed the chaotic, fractured state of Indian politics and realized something fundamental about warfare in this era. The traditional Indian armies relied heavily on massive, but largely disorganized charges of heavy cavalry.
Feudal levies, essentially. Nobles bringing their own horsemen to the fight, lacking centralized command and control.
Exactly. Dupleix saw that European military technology and, more importantly, European military discipline provided a massive asymmetrical advantage. We're talking about the deployment of highly drilled infantry using rapid-fire flintlock muskets fitted with socket bayonets.
Let's explain why that specific technology matters, because it is the mechanism that defeated the cavalry. Before the socket bayonet, you had to physically stick a dagger into the barrel of your gun, which meant you couldn't shoot.
Precisely. A socket bayonet fits around the barrel. This meant a disciplined line of infantry could unleash devastating, synchronized volleys of lead into an advancing cavalry charge and then instantly function as a wall of spears to repel the horses that survived the gunfire.
And horses will not willingly charge into a solid wall of sharp steel.
They absolutely will not. When you combine this disciplined infantry with highly mobile, rapidly firing European field artillery, traditional cavalry charges are just slaughtered.
And Dupleix didn't just use French soldiers for this, right? He outsourced it.
That was his true genius. Transporting troops from Europe was incredibly expensive and highly lethal due to disease. So Dupleix started recruiting local Indian soldiers known as Sepoys.
Okay, the Sepoys.
Yeah. He armed them with European weapons, dressed them in European-style uniforms, and relentlessly drilled them in European infantry tactics under French officers. He then began leasing out these highly effective, modern Sepoy regiments to local Indian Nawabs who were fighting civil wars against their rivals.
Oh, wow.
In exchange for providing the winning edge, the French demanded massive trade concessions, cash, and territory.
It's a pure private military contractor model. You want to secure your throne, rent our state-of-the-art army, and the EIC sees this happening, sees the French gaining massive leverage, and says, we need to replicate this immediately.
They copied the French model entirely and eventually scaled it up to a degree the French never even imagined. The East India Company transformed its corporate structure almost overnight. They went from being a heavily armed merchant marine to a full-fledged mercenary outfit.
But to execute a hostile takeover, you need a mastermind on the ground. You need an executive who sees the angles, someone who is completely unbound by traditional statecraft or morality. Enter Robert Clive.
Robert Clive. It is genuinely impossible to overstate his impact on global history. He is the archetype of the ultimate corporate predator.
Let's do a psychological and character profile of Clive, because he's fascinating in the darkest way possible. He doesn't arrive in India as a decorated general or a brilliant statesman, does he?
No, not at all.
He arrives as a low-level accountant,
A writer.
a clerk.
Yes, he was a deeply unhappy teenager sent away by his family because he was essentially a violent delinquent running extortion rackets on local shopkeepers in his English hometown.
A literal mobster teenager.
Pretty much. When he gets to India, he's described physically as thick-set, laconic, and prone to dark moods.
And he possesses this breathtaking audacity. He's a street fighter who realizes that in this chaotic new India, extreme aggression is heavily rewarded. He has a willingness to take massive, almost suicidal risks. But he also struggles with profound, intermittent mental instability. We aren't talking about a philosopher king here.
Absolutely not. Clive represents the absolute amoral birth of corporate crime on a global systemic scale. If you look at his actions, he did not care about governing people. He had no vision for the long-term civic stability of India.
Yeah, it's all about the money.
His entire operational philosophy was driven by two things: maximizing the bottom line of the East India Company and, crucially, extracting unimaginably vast personal wealth for himself. He viewed the entire subcontinent as just a ledger of assets waiting to be liquidated.
Which brings us to the true inside job, the conquest of Bengal, spanning roughly 1756 to 1757. For context, Bengal was the richest province in the former Mughal Empire. It was the absolute crown jewel of manufacturing and wealth. If you control Bengal, you control the economic engine of India.
Unquestionably.
But to get the prize, Clive needed a pretext. He needed an antagonist, and he gets one in the form of Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
Siraj-ud-Dowlah was the newly ascended Nawab of Bengal. He had inherited the throne from his grandfather. But unlike his grandfather, Siraj was young, deeply inexperienced, incredibly volatile, and widely, intensely hated by his own court and administration.
Hated feels almost like an understatement when you look at the historical records. In William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, he says Siraj was viewed by his own cousin as a serial bisexual rapist and psychopath.
Yeah, those are strong words.
This isn't just an unpopular ruler. This is a deeply destabilizing figure running the wealthiest province in the region. And he fundamentally distrusts the East India Company.
He had very good reason to distrust them, as they were continually overstepping their bounds. Siraj discovers that the EIC is fortifying their settlement in Calcutta without his legal permission, essentially treating his sovereign territory as their own. When he orders them to stop, they ignore him. Enraged, Siraj marches his army on Calcutta.
And the EIC leadership in Calcutta completely falls apart. It's a stunning display of cowardice.
It was humiliating. The senior corporate leadership, The men who had provoked the Nawab in the first place absolutely panicked. They boarded the company ships and just fled down the river, abandoning the lower-ranking factors, the soldiers, and the local allied merchants to be captured by Siraj's army.
Unbelievable. When word of this total corporate collapse reaches Robert Clive, who is stationed further south in Madras, he doesn't just put together a rescue mission to restore trade rights. He looks at the political dynamic in Bengal and decides to orchestrate a complete hostile takeover.
This is where Clive's street fighter mentality perfectly aligns with corporate opportunism. Clive realizes something vital. Siraj-ud-Dowlah is so despised, so erratic, that his own inner circle, his generals, his administrators, desperately want him removed.
They want a regime change.
Exactly. Clive sees a deeply fractured executive board, and he decides to fund a mutiny.
And to do that, he partners with the true power brokers in Bengal. Not the military, but the financial sector, the Jagat Seth bankers.
The Jagat Seths were essentially the central bank of the region. They were a Marwari banking family possessing wealth that rivaled the Bank of England. They controlled the flow of credit, the minting of coins, and the massive Hawala transfer networks that moved revenue.
Let's explain why an accountant like Clive teaming up with local bankers is the real weapon here. If you alienate your central bank in the 18th century, how do you pay your soldiers?
You don't. And if you can't pay a mercenary army, they immediately mutiny or desert. The Jagat Seths had decided Siraj was bad for business. They reached out to Clive, essentially offering to finance the EIC's military campaign if Clive would help them install a new, compliant Nawab.
So they find an inside man, Mir Jafar.
Yes. Mir Jafar was an elderly, uneducated Arab soldier of fortune who served as one of Siraj's primary generals.
I want to push back a little bit on Clive's reputation as a military genius here. You're painting Clive as this terrifying corporate mastermind, but from what you're saying, he just kind of stumbled into a situation where the Nawab's own bankers were looking for a hitman, and they just handed him the commander of the enemy army. Was Clive a genius, or just a thug who happened to be handed the perfect inside job?
That is a highly debated point, and honestly, I lean towards your interpretation. Clive's true genius was his total lack of scruples. He didn't devise some brilliant tactical maneuver. He engaged in massive high-stakes bribery. Clive, the bankers, and Mir Jafar struck a secret deal.
And what was the deal?
The EIC would march its army towards Siraj. When the battle commenced, Mir Jafar would hold his massive contingent of troops back, ensuring Siraj's defeat. In return, Mir Jafar would be elevated to Nawab, and he would personally owe millions of rupees in reparations to the EIC and to Clive personally.
Which culminates in the famous Battle of Plassey in 1757. It's often cited as the turning point of global history. But calling it a battle almost feels like false advertising. It was a rigged transaction.
It was entirely theatrical. Clive's small, disciplined force met Siraj's massive army. A brief artillery duel occurred, a rainstorm dampened the Nawab's gunpowder, and when Siraj ordered his cavalry to charge, Mir Jafar simply refused to move his troops.
He just stood there.
Yep. Siraj realized he was betrayed, fled the field, and was subsequently captured and murdered by Mir Jafar's son.
So Clive wins. He walks directly into the treasury of Bengal, literally wading through vaults stacked with silver, gold, and jewels, and claims a staggering fortune for himself and the company. But the true deviousness of this crime is the structural setup they leave behind. They don't officially plant the British flag. They install Mir Jafar on the throne.
They needed the illusion of local sovereignty. The company directors in London didn't want the legal and financial burden of officially administering a massive Indian province. They wanted a puppet who'd absorb all the administrative costs while handing over all the profits.
But Mir Jafar was just that, a puppet. Clive knew exactly what he was purchasing. Clive himself openly referred to Jafar as a prince of little capacity. The EIC actively did not want a strong, competent partner. They wanted a local CEO they could entirely control and endlessly extort. With Plassey, they transformed from a trading company subject to local laws into an autonomous imperial power that dictated who ruled.
But as any corporate raider knows, an initial buyout is rarely the end of the struggle. Plassey was the break-in, but the puppets eventually realized the strings are choking them. Mir Jafar, drained of his wealth by EIC demands, proves totally useless. So the EIC quietly replaces him with his son-in-law, Mir Kassim.
But Mir Kassim turns out to be a massive miscalculation by the EIC, right? Because he's actually highly capable.
He was. Mir Kassim looks at the ledgers and realizes the EIC's corrupt trade practices, refusing to pay local transit duties, terrorizing local merchants, are bleeding the Bengal economy completely dry.
He sees the writing on the wall.
He tries to enforce the law against the company agents. When they refuse, he realizes war is inevitable. So he acts. He relocates his capital away from Calcutta, and he begins aggressively building a modern, disciplined army of his own, hiring European mercenaries to train his sepoys, just as the EIC had done.
And he doesn't just build an army, he builds a coalition. The resistance really mounts.
Mir Kassim teams up with the neighboring Nawab of Awa, who possesses a massive army, and crucially, they are joined by the exiled, currently landless Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam. This combined force meets the East India Company's army at the Battle of Buxar in 1764.
Now, Buxar is the real military victory, isn't it? Plassey was a rigged fight bought with banker silver, but Buxar proved the EIC was genuinely the supreme military force on the subcontinent.
Absolutely. At Buxar, despite being heavily outnumbered by a coalition force that actually had modern artillery and trained infantry, the EIC sepoys demonstrated superior fire discipline and tactical cohesion. They shattered the Indian coalition, the Nawab of Awadh fled, and the Mughal emperor Shah Alam surrendered directly to the British camp.
And the extortion that follows Buxar is what permanently changes the global economy. This is the ultimate non-negotiable contract.
We arrive at August 1765. This is the moment the true crime climax occurs. Clive, having returned to India for a second stint, sits down with the young, defeated Emperor Shah Alam. And Clive forces him to sign a legal document called the Diwani.
Let's clearly define what the Diwani actually entails, because this is the cornerstone of the entire corporate empire. It sounds like a boring bureaucratic treaty, but its implications are terrifying.
It's staggering.
The emperor legally hands over the right to collect all revenues, all taxes, in the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. We are talking about granting a private corporation the right to tax 20 million people. And he hands this sovereign right to roughly 250 East India Company clerks who are backed by a private army of 20,000 sepoys.
It is an unprecedented, staggering transfer of wealth and power. To understand the gravity, you have to look at how trade worked before 1765. The EIC had to load ships in London with massive amounts of silver and gold bullion, sail it to India, and trade that hard currency for Indian textiles and spices.
Which was a massive continual drain on the British economy.
Exactly.
Right. But after the Diwani, let's use an analogy to explain the mechanics of what they did next, because it's essentially an infinite money glitch.
I love this analogy.
Imagine if a modern company like Amazon didn't just sell you goods, but was legally granted the power by the government to act as the IRS. Amazon collects your income tax directly from your paycheck. And then, instead of using that tax money to build roads or fund schools, Amazon uses your own tax money to manufacture the goods they then sell back to you, or ship overseas to sell for 100% profit.
That analogy is frighteningly accurate. After 1765, the East India Company entirely stopped shipping silver to India. They used their private mercenary army to violently and ruthlessly extract agricultural taxes from the Indian peasantry.
Just shaking them down.
Yep. They then used that stolen, extracted tax revenue to purchase the Indian textiles they wanted, shipped them to Europe, and kept all the profit. They were buying Indian goods with Indian money.
It is the most perfect, airtight, legally sanctioned extortion racket in human history. A private corporation now functions as a sovereign state, but they have deliberately stripped away all the civic responsibilities of a state.
None whatsoever.
They don't maintain infrastructure. They don't fund a judiciary. They don't provide famine relief or agricultural support. They do nothing but run the extractive machinery.
Which brings us directly to the fallout. Because you cannot extract that volume of wealth from an organic, functioning society without fundamentally breaking it. We need to examine the plunder, the resulting catastrophe, and eventually how the long arm of the law attempted to rein this monster in.
Let's start with the human cost, because the psychological shock to the Indian populace was profound. How did the victims, especially the highly educated, refined elites of the Mughal system, witness their world fall apart?
The despair was absolute. The Mughal elite had presided over an era of immense wealth, profound architectural achievements, and high Persian-influenced culture. Suddenly, they found themselves subjected to the whims of foreign accountants whose only cultural interest was double-entry bookkeeping.
The cultural whiplash must have been dizzying. In William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, he says, quoting a devastated Mughal official reflecting on the changing times, "What honor is left to us when we have to take orders from a handful of traders who have not yet learned to wash their bottoms?"
It perfectly encapsulates this mixture of profound tragedy and utter visceral disdain.
Right. Disdain for the uncouth, culturally illiterate corporate clerks who now dictate their survival.
And you can see the physical manifestation of this tragedy in the literal desolation of Delhi. Remember, this was the city recently described as a cage of nightingales. Following the invasions and the subsequent loss of all provincial tax revenue to the EIC, Delhi collapsed.
This fell apart.
The Persian histories from the era describe it with visceral, haunting horror. Jackals were literally howling in the ruined, abandoned mansions of the aristocracy. The grass was growing waist-high around fallen marble pillars in the bazaars. Noblemen who once commanded vast armies and patronized the arts were reduced to cutting grass in the streets just to feed their starving families.
And I don't think anything symbolizes this agonizing fall from grace, quite like the deeply tragic fate of the emperor himself, Shah Alam.
Shah Alam is arguably the most tragic figure in this entire narrative. He wasn't a coward. He was cultured, resilient, and despite suffering endless military defeats, he continually tried to piece the fragments of his empire back together.
But he had no real power.
Right. His total lack of military and financial power made him incredibly vulnerable to the warlords circling Delhi. In 1787, a psychotic, deeply traumatized Rohilla warlord named Ghulam Qadir managed to capture Delhi and the Red Fort.
And what he does to the imperial family is just horrific.
It's the darkest brutality. Ghulam Qadir, seeking hidden treasure that didn't even exist, tortured the imperial family. He starved them, he had the women of the royal household stripped and assaulted, and then, in a fit of rage, he physically pinned Shah Alam down and brutally, personally blinded the emperor with a dagger.
He gouged the emperor's eyes out. And what makes this relevant to our corporate story is the EIC's reaction. The company officially derived its entire legal right to exist and tax Bengal from a treaty signed by Shah Alam. They nominally recognized him as their sovereign. What do they do to protect him?
Absolutely nothing. They possessed the largest modern army in the subcontinent, stationed just down the river, and they sat on their hands because intervening in Delhi didn't offer an immediate financial return on investment.
Wow.
When the dust finally settled and the Marathas eventually chased Ghulam Qadir away, Shah Alam was left sitting on a cheap wooden replica of the stolen peacock throne. He was a sightless monarch ruling over the absolute, hollow illusion of an empire, while the East India Company continued to efficiently drain the lifeblood from his former provinces.
And that systematic draining of lifeblood leads to what is, without question, the most morally bankrupt chapter of this entire story. This is true corporate manslaughter, the Bengal famine of 1770.
The Diwani gave the East India Company the legal right to tax, and they executed that right with terrifying, soulless corporate efficiency and zero human empathy. Upon taking over, they massively increased the tax assessments on the peasantry to hit revenue targets.
They just squeezed them.
They strictly enforced agricultural monopolies on grain and other essential goods. They dismantled the traditional societal safety nets, the granaries and tax forgiveness programs that the previous Nawabs had meticulously maintained for centuries to hedge against bad harvests.
They also forced farmers to stop growing edible grain and switch to cash crops like indigo and silk, which the company would export, right?
Right.
So the local food supply shrinks drastically. And then in 1769, the monsoon rains fail. A severe drought hits.
Exactly. Droughts happen in India. It's a geographic reality. But previously, the society had reserves. Under the EIC, the population had absolutely nothing. No stored money, no stored grain, and the resulting famine was apocalyptic.
This is where the sheer banality of corporate evil comes into focus. We aren't talking about soldiers shooting civilians in the streets. We are talking about clerks writing numbers in ledgers. Millions of people are starving to death.
It's estimated that up to 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal perished.
1/3.
Corpses choked the Hooghly River. They piled up in the streets of Calcutta right outside the windows of the East India Company offices.
And how did the company respond? Did they open the corporate coffers to offer relief? Did they pause taxation to let the peasantry survive?
No, they ruthlessly, violently enforced tax collection to ensure that their stock price in the London markets didn't dip. In fact, local EIC administrators actually increased the tax rate on the surviving population by 10% to make up for the revenue lost from the dead.
It's almost hard to believe.
That is corporate amorality operating at its absolute terrifying peak.
And local company agents were actively profiteering off the starvation. They hoarded what little grain was available and sold it back to the starving population at massively inflated prices just to build private fortunes. It was complete systemic failure of humanity, driven entirely by the singular, unyielding imperative of shareholder return. So
Exactly.
we have to ask, what does this all mean for the people back in London? Because eventually, word gets back. You cannot hide the deaths of millions of people forever, especially when the men responsible are returning home unimaginably wealthy.
And return they did. These returning EIC agents were derisively called nabobs, which is a British corruption of the word nawab. They returned to England with wealth that dwarfed the old aristocratic fortunes, buying up massive country estates and attempting to buy their way into high society.
And the investigation begins. The whistleblowers start talking, and the public realizes what is actually funding these nabobs.
When the news of the Bengal famine hit the British press, alongside reports of the astronomical fortunes being flaunted by these nabobs, public opinion in Britain shifted violently.
It becomes a massive PR nightmare for the company. Horace Walpole, the famous English writer and politician, wrote a letter stating that the groans of India have mounted to heaven.
Powerful words.
There is genuine, palpable moral outrage in Britain. The public is slowly realizing that this joint stock company is committing horrific atrocities in the name of the British nation.
But the East India Company was heavily insulated against public outrage, because long before modern corporations hired K Street firms in Washington, the EIC had essentially invented corporate lobbying.
This is a crucial point in the birth of corporate crime. How did they survive this overwhelming public backlash? They literally bought the government.
They did. The EIC recognized early in its existence that its true ultimate power base was not just its army in India, it was its influence in the halls of parliament. As far back as 1693, the company was caught red-handed using company shares to directly bribe members of parliament to maintain their trade monopoly.
Wow, 1693.
By the time of the Bengal famine, the integration was complete. Nearly a quarter of all members of parliament personally owned East India Company stock.
It was an entirely corrupt, deeply entrenched public-private partnership. The British state provided the Royal Navy to protect the EIC's ships on the high seas, and the EIC provided endless rivers of cash to British politicians. It's a textbook definition of regulatory capture, functioning on a scale that is almost unimaginable even today.
But the sheer scale of the horror, the millions dead in the famine, the blatant, naked corruption of the nabobs, was eventually too much even for the company lobbyists to entirely suppress. This moral reckoning culminates in the dramatic 7-year impeachment trial of Warren Hastings.
Now, Hastings is a fascinating figure here. He was the first Governor General of India. And what's deeply ironic is that Hastings was actually something of an Indophile. Unlike Clive, Hastings spoke fluent Urdu and Persian. He patronized Islamic and Hindu scholars.
He was definitely different from Clive.
He actually tried, in his own flawed way, to establish some semblance of civic governance and legal frameworks, rather than just overseeing pure naked looting.
That is the tragic irony of his position. Hastings tried to rationalize and reform the system, but the fundamental nature of the system, a corporation demanding ever-increasing dividends from an occupied territory, was inherently, unavoidably exploitative. And when the political pressure in London boiled over, Hastings became the highly visible scapegoat.
And Edmund Burke enters the chat.
Yes. The great philosopher and orator Edmund Burke led the impeachment against him in Parliament.
And Burke was unrelenting. It was the political theater of the century. Burke pursued Hastings for years, publicly tearing him apart, calling him a rat, a weasel, and famously labeling him a captain general of iniquity.
While Hastings was ultimately acquitted by the House of Lords, partly because the EIC's lobbying power and deeply entrenched financial interests were still just too strong to topple entirely, the trial served a massive historical purpose. It exposed the EIC's crimes, its brutal extortion tactics, and the reality of its rule to the entire world. The curtain was permanently pulled back.
It proved to the British state that you cannot outsource the governance of millions of human beings to a boardroom of shareholders. It was the beginning of the end of the company's absolute autonomy. Parliament began passing a series of regulations, slowly but surely tightening the leash and bringing the EIC under state supervision.
But the company wasn't dead yet.
Right. In fact, before its demise, it was about to enact its final, most massive takeover.
Exactly. From a rogue corporation to an outright empire. As we enter the late 18th and early 19th century, the British state, now having more say in company affairs, sends a new breed of Governor General Richard Wellesley.
And Wellesley doesn't care about the price of calico cloth. He's an aristocrat, and he is a hardcore, unapologetic imperialist.
Wellesley despised the mercantile penny-pinching mentality of the EIC directors sitting in London. He didn't want to balance ledgers. He wanted total, undisputed geopolitical dominion over the subcontinent. He utilized the company's now vast tax-funded resources to launch a series of relentless, aggressive wars of expansion.
Where did he strike first?
He first targeted the south, defeating the fierce, deeply innovative warrior Tipu Sultan of Mysore, effectively bringing southern India under EIC control. And then he set his sights on the only remaining power capable of challenging them, the Marathas.
The same Marathas who had bled Aurangzeb dry and filled the power vacuum of the Mughals.
Yes. But the Marathas were now deeply divided by internal civil war. Wellesley's armies, led in part by his younger brother Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington and defeat Napoleon, outmaneuvered and defeated the brilliant Maratha leaders.
So the military machine is just unstoppable at this point.
Highly professionalized and massive. By this point, they possessed a private army of 200,000 men.
Just pause and really process that number for a second. A private, publicly traded corporation maintained a standing army of 200,000 men. That was twice the size of the official British National Army at the time.
It was unparalleled corporate militarism, and this violent expansion culminated in 1803. The EIC army officially marches into Delhi. They defeat the Maratha forces guarding the city, and they take direct control of the blind, elderly, tragic Emperor Shah Alam.
Completely absorbing the final, pathetic remains of the Mughal Empire under the cynical guise of protecting him. It's the final nail in the coffin. The takeover is entirely complete. A 5-window office in London now officially owned the subcontinent.
Which brings us to the ultimate resolution of our true crime thriller. Because a rogue corporation, no matter how powerful, heavily armed, or politically connected, cannot run a continent indefinitely, the contradictions eventually tear it apart.
So what is the final catalyst? I have to ask, because I look at this and formulate a hypothesis. It feels like at 200,000 troops, they are fundamentally too big to fail. They've bought parliament, they own the tax base of a subcontinent, they possess an unmatched military. By all modern corporate logic, there is no structural reason they shouldn't still be ruling India today.
Your logic is sound, but it ignores the human element, which, corporate ledgers always fail to account for. The British Parliament, continuously prodded by the horrific revelations of the Hastings trial, and genuinely fearful of the sheer, unbridled power the EIC wielded independently of the Crown, realized they had to intervene.
They had to step in.
Through a slow series of legislative actions, starting with the Regulating Act and Pitt's India Act, the government systematically stripped the EIC of its commercial monopolies and its political autonomy. They were slowly transforming the corporation from an independent sovereign into a bureaucratic administrative wing of the British state.
But the actual final death of the East India Company wasn't some peaceful boardroom buyout.
Yeah.
It was soaked in blood.
It was deeply violent. The end comes following the Great Uprising of 1857. The EIC's own Sepoys, the very military instrument that had conquered the subcontinent for them, were pushed to the absolute brink.
The breaking point.
Decades of heavy-handed cultural insensitivity, aggressive corporate annexations of local kingdoms, and brutal, unyielding economic policies finally ignited a massive rebellion across northern India.
And the EIC's response to this rebellion was horrific. They didn't try to negotiate. They violently suppressed the uprising. They executed tens of thousands of suspected rebels, often in the most gruesome public manners possible to instill terror. It was an absolute bloodbath.
It was the final, catastrophic, undeniable failure of corporate governance. The British state looked at the chaos, the slaughter, and the financial ruin of the 1857 uprising and decided that the EIC was an untenable liability.
They had to pull the plug.
In 1858, the Victorian state officially stepped in and nationalized the East India Company. Queen Victoria took over direct imperial rule of India. The corporate charter was formally revoked. The company's private army was absorbed into the British military, and the most powerful multinational corporation in human history was quietly dissolved into the bureaucracy of the British Empire.
It is an incredibly dense, staggering story. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Look around at the geopolitical landscape of the world today. Look at our modern multinational corporations, the tech monoliths, the energy conglomerates, the financial institutions.
They're everywhere.
It's true. They do not currently command private uniformed armies of 200,000 men. They do not literally overthrow sovereign governments with grape shot and cannon fire. But look closely at the power they do wield. They possess massive, unprecedented, legally sanctioned lobbying power in global capitals.
Just like the EIC did.
Exactly. They control vital global resources, the flow of digital information, and the physical infrastructure of our lives. They frequently shape international legislation to suit their profit margins. They often operate through complex offshore tax havens, effectively rendering themselves beyond the reach of any single national legal system.
It's a sobering thought.
The East India Company might be gone, dissolved into the dusty pages of history, and replaced by a state empire. But the operational blueprint for corporate dominance they invented, the leveraging of immense concentrated wealth to bypass the state, the absolute prioritization of the shareholder above the citizen, the relentless drive to extract maximum value, regardless of the human cost, that blueprint is still very much alive and functioning in our world.
It really is.
Is it possible that the age of the corporate state never actually ended? Did it just evolve into something cleaner, quieter, and infinitely harder to dismantle?
That is the truly chilling question this history leaves us with. I mean, the East India Company proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that capital, when entirely unregulated and driven solely by the mandate of profit, will inevitably seek absolute power. It's a terrifying historical lesson that we are quite clearly still grappling with today.
Definitely something to critically consider the next time you check your stock portfolio or agree to a corporate terms of service. See you next time with more such stories.